The Mafia boss only came in for a repair, a quiet garage, grease-stained floors, a man who fixed engines for a living, not people. While the mechanic worked under the hood, he noticed the girl in the back seat. She couldn't walk. Her legs rested lifeless beneath a thin blanket, but her eyes followed everything, curious, alert, intelligent, too aware. Most people looked away. The mechanic didn't. He watched how she shifted her weight, how her hands clenched when the car vibrated, how her feet tried to move but couldn't. That night, after the car drove away, the mechanic stayed behind. He pulled scrap metal from a bin, old hinges, springs, brackets, parts no one wanted. By morning, his hands were bleeding, but on his workbench stood something new, a simple, handmade walking support, crude, ugly, but built exactly for her. When the Mafia boss returned the next day, annoyed about a noise, the mechanic hesitated, then spoke. "May I try something with your daughter?" The man almost said, "No, almost." The girl was lowered into the frame. Her legs trembled. Then slowly she stood, one step, then another. The garage went silent, because the poor mechanic hadn't just fixed a car, he had built a future. And the man watching was powerful enough to change the mechanic's life forever. Stay with me until the end, because the reward the Mafia boss gives next will change the poor mechanic's life forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The garage door rattled shut on Tuesday morning, leaving Marco Santos alone with the silence that had become his closest companion. 38 years old, hands permanently stained with motor oil, and a bank account that mocked his monthly rent payments. The sign outside read, Santos Auto Repair, but most days it felt more like Santos Auto Struggle. Marco had inherited the garage from his uncle 3 years ago, along with debts that seemed to multiply faster than the rust on abandoned car parts scattered around the property. The neighborhood had changed since Uncle Eduardo first opened the doors in 1987. What was once a bustling working-class district had become something darker, something people whispered about behind closed doors. The sound of expensive engines wasn't unusual here anymore. Black sedans with tinted windows, men in tailored suits who paid in cash and asked no questions. Marco had learned to keep his head down, fix what needed fixing, and forget what he'd seen. Survival in this part of town meant mastering the art of selective blindness, but Tuesday morning would test that philosophy in ways Marco never imagined. The rumble started low, growing louder until it seemed to shake the very foundation of his modest garage. Through the grimy window, Marco watched a convoy approach. 3 black Escalades moving in formation, their chrome gleaming despite the morning haze, the kind of vehicles that announced their owners before anyone stepped out. The lead car pulled into his garage bay with mechanical precision. Marco wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades and approached cautiously. The driver's door opened, revealing a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Vincent Torino stood 6 feet tall, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. His suit probably cost more than Marco made in 3 months, but it was his eyes that told the real story. Cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd built an empire on fear and respect. "Good morning," Marco said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What can I do for you?" "The engine's making a noise," Torino replied, his accent carrying traces of the old neighborhood. "Something's not right under the hood." Marco nodded, popping the latch and lifting the heavy hood. As he leaned in to examine the pristine engine, his peripheral vision caught movement in the back seat. Through the tinted rear window, he glimpsed a figure, small, young, motionless. The Escalade's engine purred like a contented cat. Marco ran his hands over hoses, checked fluid levels, listened for irregularities. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, but he'd learned that expensive cars sometimes developed expensive problems that only revealed themselves under specific conditions. While Marco worked, His eyes kept drifting to the back seat. The figure hadn't moved. Not once. Curiosity battled with common sense, and for once, curiosity won. "Excuse me," Marco said, straightening up and addressing Torino. "Would you mind if I started the engine and took a quick test drive? Sometimes these issues only show up when the car's in motion." Torino's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes, something that might have been vulnerability, quickly masked. "Do what you need to do." Marco slid into the driver's seat, his calloused hands foreign against the leather steering wheel. As he adjusted the rearview mirror, he finally saw her clearly. She was maybe 14, with dark hair that framed a face too serious for her age. Her eyes were the same penetrating gray as her father's, but where his held calculation, hers held something else. Pain. Not physical pain, though Marco suspected that was there too. This was deeper. The pain of watching the world from a distance, of being present but not participating. Her legs lay still beneath a cashmere blanket. Too still. Marco had worked with machinery his entire life, understood the difference between something that was turned off and something that was broken. These legs weren't just resting. They couldn't move. The girl noticed his gaze in the mirror and met it directly. No shame, no plea for pity. Just acknowledgement. Two people seeing each other clearly for a brief moment. Marco started the engine and pulled out of the garage slowly. As they drove through the neighborhood, he found himself studying her reactions in the mirror. When they hit a pothole, she winced almost imperceptibly. When he took a turn too quickly, her hands gripped the seat. Her body was trapped, but her mind was sharp, aware of every sensation the vehicle transmitted. Back at the garage, Marco shut off the engine and sat for a moment in the expensive silence. "I couldn't replicate the noise you mentioned," he told Torino, "but I'd like to keep the car overnight, run some diagnostic tests. Sometimes these intermittent issues are tricky to pin down." Torino's jaw tightened. This car doesn't stay anywhere overnight. Marco understood. Men like Torino didn't leave their vehicles, especially with their family inside, in unfamiliar places. But something about the girl's eyes had lodged itself in his consciousness, like a splinter. "Of course," Marco said. "Bring it back tomorrow morning. Same time. I'll have my equipment ready for a more thorough inspection." As the convoy pulled away, Marco stood in his empty garage and tried to shake the image of those gray eyes from his mind. He had work to do, bills to pay, a business to somehow keep afloat in a neighborhood where honest work competed with easier money. But that night, as rain drummed against the garage roof, Marco found himself unable to focus on the invoices spread across his desk. Instead, he walked through his cluttered workspace, seeing it through different eyes. The wheelchair ramp Uncle Eduardo had installed years ago for a customer who'd never returned for his car. The adjustable workbench that could accommodate someone seated. The wide doorways that most people never noticed. Marco's uncle had been a different kind of man. He'd served in Vietnam, came home with shrapnel in his leg, and a philosophy that everyone deserved dignity, regardless of what they could or couldn't do. He'd modified his garage not because he had to, but because he believed it was right. Standing in the shadows of his inherited workspace, Marco realized he'd been seeing only half the picture. He fixed engines because that's what people brought him. But what about the problems they didn't bring? What about the challenges they carried in silence? The girl's face haunted him, not because of her condition, but because of her intelligence. She was trapped in a body that wouldn't obey, but her mind was clearly sharp. How many opportunities was she missing? How many experiences were passing her by? Marco walked to the corner where Uncle Eduardo's old projects gathered dust. Prototype mobility aids, experimental designs, dreams built from scrap metal and determination. His uncle had always believed that engineering was about solving problems, not just the ones that paid well. As thunder rolled across the city, Marco pulled a tarp away from his uncle's forgotten workshop. Beneath lay tools he'd never used, blueprints he'd never studied, and possibilities he'd never considered. Tomorrow, Vincent Torino would return with his expensive car and his trapped daughter, and Marco Santos would make a decision that would change everything. The rain continued falling, washing the city clean, preparing it for whatever came next. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of unfinished business. Marco had barely slept, his mind cycling through measurements and calculations. The device on his workbench looked primitive compared to the luxury surrounding Vincent Torino's world, but it was built with something money couldn't buy: understanding. The convoy returned at exactly 9 o'clock. Same formation, same precision. But this time, Marco was ready. As Torino stepped out of the lead vehicle, his expression carried the impatience of a man accustomed to quick solutions. "The engine noise better be gone," his tone suggested, without words needing to be spoken. Marco approached the car, but his attention wasn't on the engine anymore. Through the rear window, he caught another glimpse of those gray eyes. The girl was watching him, and something in her gaze suggested she remembered their brief connection from yesterday. "Let me take another look under the hood," Marco said, lifting the heavy panel. But as he pretended to examine the pristine engine, his real focus was on building courage for what came next. The moment stretched like a held breath. Marco's hands moved over familiar components while his mind rehearsed words that could either change everything or destroy him. Men like Torino didn't appreciate unsolicited suggestions, especially concerning their families. Finally, Marco straightened up and wiped his hands on his rag. "The engine sounds fine to me," he said carefully. "But I noticed something yesterday that might interest you." Torino's eyes narrowed slightly. Marco felt the temperature in the garage drop several degrees. "Your daughter," Marco continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I think I might be able to help her." The silence that followed was dangerous. Torino stepped closer, and Marco could smell expensive cologne mixed with something harder to define. Power, authority, the scent of a man who solved problems permanently. "You think you can help her?" Torino's voice was deceptively quiet. "Doctors at Johns Hopkins couldn't help her. Specialists in Switzerland couldn't help her. Physical therapists who charge more per hour than you make in a week couldn't help her. But you think you can?" Marco felt sweat beading on his forehead, but he held his ground. "I don't know about medical treatment," he said, "but I know about mobility, about making things work that weren't working before." He gestured toward his workbench where the crude walking support waited under a canvas tarp. "I built something. It's not pretty and it's not expensive, but it might give her some independence." Torino followed Marco's gaze, then looked back with an expression that could have cut steel. "You built something, in your garage, for my daughter." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marco realized he was standing at a crossroads, where one path led to safety and the other led into unknown territory that could end very badly for him. But then he heard something that changed everything. A soft voice from inside the car. "Daddy, what did he build?" The voice belonged to the girl, and it carried a note Marco recognized immediately. Hope. Desperate, carefully hidden hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen what everyone else missed. Torino's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The cold calculation remained. But beneath it, Marco glimpsed something else. Love. Fear. The vulnerability of a father who would do anything for his child, but had run out of options. "Show me," Torino said quietly. Marco pulled away the tarp, revealing his creation in the harsh, fluorescent light. The walking support was assembled from salvaged materials, held together with welds that weren't pretty but were strong. The frame was adjustable, with carefully positioned grips and supports that could bear weight while allowing natural movement. "It's not much to look at," Marco admitted, "but I designed it specifically for her height and weight distribution. The support points align with her natural center of gravity, and the mobility assistance is graduated." Torino examined the device with the same intensity he'd probably used to evaluate business deals that involved millions of dollars and people's lives. His fingers traced the welds, tested the joints, assessed the engineering with surprising technical knowledge. "How do you know this will work?" he asked. "I don't," Marco replied honestly. "But I watched how she moves in the car, how she compensates for balance, how her upper body strength tries to do what her legs can't. This is designed around her capabilities, not her limitations." The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the almost inaudible sound of the girl's breathing from inside the car. Marco realized that 3 lives were balanced on the edge of this moment. His own, certainly, but also hers, and perhaps even her father's. Torino walked to the car and opened the rear door. When he spoke to his daughter, his voice carried a gentleness that seemed impossible from the same man who'd radiated danger moments before. "Sophia," he said, "this man thinks he built something that might help you walk." The girl's eyes widened, and Marco saw years of disappointment and false hope war with desperate desire. She'd probably heard similar promises from experts with impressive credentials and expensive equipment. But something about her expression suggested she was willing to risk disappointment one more time. "Can I try it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Torino looked at Marco with an expression that conveyed a simple message. "If you hurt my daughter, if you give her false hope and break her heart, nothing will save you." Marco nodded, understanding completely. He approached the car slowly, respectfully, waiting for permission before reaching to help Sophia from the vehicle. She was lighter than he'd expected, and as he lifted her, he felt the complete stillness of her legs. But her upper body was strong. Her core muscles developed from years of compensation. She'd been working to overcome her limitations long before Marco met her. As he lowered her into the walking support, Marco made tiny adjustments, aligning the frame with her body's natural positioning. The device held her weight securely, while allowing her arms freedom to grip the handles. For a moment, Sophia just stood there, supported by Marco's creation, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then, carefully, tentatively, she shifted her weight forward. The device moved with her, providing stability while allowing natural motion. Her first step was hesitant, uncertain, but it was a step, then another, and another. The garage filled with something Marco had never experienced before. Pure, transformative joy. Sophia's face lit up with an expression of wonder and accomplishment that made every sleepless hour worth it. She was walking. Not easily, not gracefully, but she was moving under her own power. Tears streamed down her face as she took another step, then turned carefully to look at her father. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm walking." Torino's composure cracked completely. The powerful man who commanded respect through fear stood watching his daughter take her first steps in years, and his own eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. Marco stepped back, giving them space for a moment that belonged to family. But as he watched Sophia navigate her first independent steps, he realized he'd stumbled into something far more significant than a simple repair job. He'd changed a life, and in doing so, he'd caught the attention of a man who had the power to change his. Sophia took another step, then another, her confidence building with each movement. The walking support moved with her like an extension of her own body, providing stability without restricting her natural motion. For the first time in 3 years, she was experiencing the world from a standing height, seeing over counters and tables, meeting people at eye level. Marco watched in silent amazement as she navigated a small circle around the garage floor. Each step was deliberate, careful, but undeniably real. The crude device he'd welded together from salvaged parts was performing exactly as he'd hoped, maybe even better. "This is incredible," Sophia breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "I can see everything differently. I can reach things. I can..." Her words trailed off as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about walking. This was about independence, dignity, the possibility of a future she'd stopped imagining. Torino approached his daughter slowly, his earlier composure completely abandoned. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "How does it feel, Princess?" "Like I remember," she whispered. Like I'm myself. Again. Marco stepped forward, his mechanic's mind already identifying small adjustments that could improve the device's performance. The left support could be raised a quarter inch. The grip padding could be repositioned for better comfort. But those were refinements. The core concept was working perfectly. How long did this take you to build? Torino asked, his businessman's instincts reasserting themselves even through his emotional overwhelm. Most of the night, Marco admitted. But I've been thinking about the design for years. My uncle used to work on mobility projects. He taught me that every problem has a solution if you're willing to look at it from the right angle. Torino examined the walking support more closely, his trained eye assessing the craftsmanship despite its rough appearance. The welds were strong. The materials, while salvaged, were carefully selected. The engineering was sound, even elegant in its simplicity. You did this for free, Torino observed. Why? Marco hesitated, unsure how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. Because she needed it, he said finally. Because I could build it. Because sometimes that's reason enough. The answer seemed to surprise Torino. In his world, every action had a calculated motive. Every favor came with an expected return. Genuine altruism was rare enough to be suspicious. Sophia continued her careful exploration of the garage, growing more confident with each step. She paused at Marco's workbench, studying the organized tools with the same intensity her father brought to business negotiations. You built this from spare parts? She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Mostly, Marco confirmed. The frame is from an old hospital bed someone threw away. The joints are modified hydraulic components from a car lift. The padding came from a motorcycle seat that was beyond repair. Sophia ran her fingers along the support rails, feeling the rough welds that held everything together. It's not pretty, but it works better than anything the doctors ever gave me. Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding the real problem instead of following conventional approaches, Marco said. The medical equipment is designed for general use. This was designed specifically for you. Torino had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity. His daughter hadn't shown this much engagement or enthusiasm in months. The spark in her eyes, the excitement in her voice, these were things he'd thought were lost forever. What would it take to make this permanent? Torino asked. To refine it, improve it, make it everything she needs? Marco considered the question carefully. Better materials would help. Proper padding, adjustable components, maybe some lightweight alloys. But the basic design is solid. With some refinement, she could use this for years. How much? Torino's question was direct, businesslike. Marco shook his head. I don't want your money. This isn't about payment. The garage fell silent except for the soft sounds of Sophia's continued exploration. Torino studied Marco with the same intensity he'd once used to evaluate potential business partners and threats. Everyone wants something, Torino said quietly. In my experience, people who claim they don't are usually the most dangerous. Marco met his gaze steadily. I want to see her walk. That's all. I want to know that something I built made someone's life better. The honesty in Marco's voice was unmistakable. Torino had spent decades reading people, identifying lies and hidden agendas. What he saw in the mechanic was something he rarely encountered. Genuine goodness without expectation of reward. Sophia had made her way to the far corner of the garage where Uncle Eduardo's old projects still gathered dust. She stopped in front of a partially completed wheelchair ramp, studying its construction with obvious interest. Did your uncle build mobility aids? She asked. He tried to, Marco replied. Said everyone deserved access to the world, regardless of what their body could or couldn't do. Most of his projects never got finished, but he taught me to see possibilities instead of limitations. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. He sounds like he was a good man. He was, Marco confirmed. He would have liked meeting you. Torino watched this interaction with growing recognition. His daughter was engaging with the world in ways she hadn't for months. The walking support had given her more than mobility. It had restored her sense of agency, her belief in possibilities. "Marco," Torino said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested important words were coming. "You've given my daughter something doctors couldn't, something money couldn't buy. That creates a debt. I don't want to be in debt to you," Marco replied honestly. "No disrespect, but I know who you are. I know what kind of business you're in. I just want to fix cars and help people when I can." Torino smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Marco had seen from him. "You think I'm going to force you into something you don't want to do, aren't you?" Marco asked. "No," Torino said quietly. "What I'm going to do is make you an offer. You can accept it or decline it, no consequences either way. But I think you should hear it." Sophia had returned to their conversation, still supported by the walking frame, her face glowing with continued amazement at her newfound mobility. She looked between her father and Marco, sensing the importance of whatever was about to be discussed. "What kind of offer?" Marco asked cautiously. Torino gestured around the struggling garage, taking in the peeling paint, the outdated equipment, the obvious signs of financial hardship. "You're a talented engineer working in a failing business. Your skills are wasted on oil changes and brake repairs." Marco felt defensive. "There's nothing wrong with honest work." "I agree completely," Torino said. "But there's also nothing wrong with honest work that pays well and helps more people." He walked to the garage door, looking out at the neighborhood that had seen better days. "I own several businesses, legitimate businesses, construction companies, manufacturing facilities, transportation services. They all use vehicles, equipment, machinery that needs specialized maintenance." Marco waited, sensing more was coming. "I also know dozens of people who could benefit from what you just gave Sophia. Veterans with mobility challenges, elderly people whose insurance won't cover proper equipment, children whose parents can't afford specialized devices." The offer was becoming clearer, and Marco felt his resistance beginning to waver. "I want to hire you as chief mechanical engineer for Torino Industries. Full benefits, excellent salary, access to proper materials and equipment. Your job would be maintaining our fleet and developing mobility solutions for people who need them." Sophia looked up at Marco with hopeful eyes. "You could help other people like me?" "That would be the idea," Torino confirmed. "Marco builds solutions. We provide resources and distribution. Everyone benefits." Marco felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. This was far more than he'd expected when he'd decided to help Sophia. The offer represented everything he'd struggled to achieve: financial security, purpose, the ability to help people on a larger scale. But it also meant accepting help from Vincent Torino, entering a world where favors came with invisible strings and simple choices carried complex consequences. "I need time to think about it," Marco said finally. "Of course," Torino replied. "Take all the time you need. But remember this: Sophia took her first steps in years because you saw a problem everyone else missed and cared enough to solve it. Imagine what you could accomplish with proper resources." Sophia adjusted her grip on the walking support and took a few more steps, her confidence growing with each movement. When she looked at Marco, her eyes held gratitude that went far deeper than words could express. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me, for believing I could do more than everyone else thought." Those words hit Marco harder than any business offer could, because he understood exactly what she meant. He'd seen her potential when others saw only limitations. He'd built hope when others offered only accommodation. The garage filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through the open door, illuminating the three figures standing at the intersection of past and future. Marco's decision would determine not just his own path, but potentially the lives of countless others who needed someone to see their possibilities instead of their problems. Outside, the neighborhood continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside a humble garage, a moment was unfolding that would change everything for everyone involved. Sophia took another step forward, walking toward a future that suddenly seemed full of unexpected possibilities. Possibilities. The decision hung in the air like exhaust fumes, heavy and inescapable. Marco stared at the walking support that had transformed from scrap metal into something miraculous, watching Sophia navigate the garage with growing confidence. Each step she took echoed with possibilities he'd never imagined for himself. Torino pulled out his phone, the device looking small in his large hands. He scrolled through contacts with the efficiency of a man who controlled empires through technology and intimidation. When he found what he was looking for, he showed Marco the screen. The contact read simply, Dr. Catherine Mills, Johns Hopkins Rehabilitation Engineering. She evaluated Sophia 6 months ago, Torino explained, his voice carrying the weight of expensive disappointment. 47 years of experience, published researcher. She told me Sophia would never walk independently again. Said the spinal damage was too extensive for any assistive device to overcome. Marco looked at Sophia, who was now attempting to navigate around a stack of tires with determination that made his chest tight. The girl who supposedly would never walk independently was doing exactly that, using a device he'd built from garbage in a single night. I'm calling her right now, Torino continued. I want her to see what you've accomplished. I want her to explain how the best medical minds in the country missed what a mechanic in Arizona figured out in 12 hours. Wait, Marco said quickly. That's not necessary. I don't need recognition from doctors. This isn't about recognition, Torino replied, his finger hovering over the call button. This is about understanding what makes you different. Because different is valuable. Different changes everything. Sophia had stopped near the garage entrance, silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming in from outside. Her profile showed a girl transformed, standing tall instead of sitting helpless, engaging, with the world from a position of strength rather than accommodation. Dad, she called softly, can I show Marco something? Both men turned toward her, watching as she carefully maneuvered the walking support to face them directly. Then, with deliberate precision, she released one hand from the support rail and reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a small notebook, worn from handling, its pages filled with what looked like technical drawings and calculations. As she held it up, Marco could see sketches of wheelchair modifications, mobility devices, engineering concepts drawn with the careful precision of someone who understood mechanical principles. I've been designing things too, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and vulnerability. For 3 years, I've been sketching solutions to problems nobody else seemed to see, but I never had anyone to build them with. She opened the notebook to a page filled with detailed drawings of what looked like an advanced, walking support system. The design was sophisticated, incorporating features Marco hadn't even considered: adjustable resistance training, integrated stability sensors, modular components that could adapt to changing needs. This is what I imagined my walking frame could become, Sophia continued. If someone understood engineering the way you do, if someone cared enough to make it real. Marco stared at the drawings, recognizing immediately that Sophia possessed an intuitive understanding of biomechanical engineering that rivaled trained professionals. Her designs weren't just wishful thinking. They were practical solutions born from years of living with limitations others only studied in textbooks. You drew these yourself? Marco asked, genuine amazement in his voice. Physics was always my best subject, Sophia replied with a slight smile. When you spend 3 years analyzing why every piece of equipment fails you, you start understanding how to design equipment that wouldn't fail. Torino moved closer to examine his daughter's notebook, seeing for perhaps the first time the depth of her technical knowledge. His expression shifted from protective father to something approaching professional respect. She's been working on these designs for months, he said quietly. I thought it was just a hobby, a way to cope with the frustration. Marco looked at the notebook in Sophia's hands, then at her father, then back at the walking support that had started everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garage floor, and in those shadows, he saw the outline of a decision that would define the rest of his life. 6 months later, the Torino Mobility Foundation occupied a gleaming facility on the outskirts of Phoenix. Marco stood in his new workshop, surrounded by equipment he'd only dreamed of owning, watching a team of engineers implement Sophia's latest design. The girl who'd been trapped in a wheelchair was now the foundation's lead designer, her technical drawings transformed into reality by resources that seemed limitless. The foundation had helped over 300 people in its first half year. Veterans whose VA equipment had failed them, children whose insurance companies had abandoned them, elderly patients whose families couldn't afford proper care. Each success story started the same way Marco's had, with someone willing to see possibilities instead of problems. Vincent Torino had kept his word completely. The work was legitimate, the resources were real, and the impact was measurable. But more than that, he'd given Marco something he'd never expected from a man in his position: respect, partnership, the freedom to solve problems without worrying about profit margins or corporate bureaucracy. Sophia walked into the workshop using her latest creation, a device so advanced it made Marco's original walking support look primitive by comparison. But she still kept that first crude frame in her office, mounted on the wall like a reminder of what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations as permanent. Sometimes the most powerful people in the world aren't the ones with money or connections, Sophia had told a reporter the week before. Sometimes they're the ones who see what everyone else misses and care enough to build something about it. Sometimes they're mechanics who work all night because they believe everyone deserves to walk. Marco smiled, remembering the scared man who'd almost declined to help a Mafia boss's daughter. That version of himself seemed like a stranger now. He'd learned that the biggest transformations don't come from grand gestures or expensive solutions. They come from ordinary people who decide that someone else's suffering matters more than their own safety. The poor mechanic had indeed given a miracle, but in return, he'd received something even more valuable: purpose, community, the knowledge that his skills could change lives in ways he'd never imagined. And sometimes, that's the greatest reward of all.